November 8, 1942, Oran, Algeria. An American soldier has just taken a German prisoner and is offering him a cigarette. The prisoner is a Feldwebel from the German-Italian Panzer Army's liaison detachment in North Africa, a professional soldier who has been in the Wehrmacht since 1938 and who has been in the specific professional circumstances of the German-Italian forces in North Africa since the previous year. A man whose understanding of captivity has been built from the German military's training about what to do when captured, and from the German military's ideological formation about what the enemy is likely to do with a German prisoner, which the formation has not been preparing him for cigarette offers. The prisoner's capture in the first hours of Operation Torch has placed him in the specific and disorienting circumstances of a prisoner taken so quickly after the opening of a new front that neither he nor his captor has had time to develop the psychological distance that sustained combat produces between adversaries. The American soldier is a corporal from the 1st Infantry Division's 18th Infantry Regiment, a 21-year-old from Ohio whose military career has been 3 months old when it began on the transport across the Atlantic, and who has been in North Africa for approximately 6 hours when he takes this prisoner in the fighting around Oran's outer defenses. He has not been taught to offer cigarettes to prisoners. He has not been briefed on the intelligence value of establishing rapport with newly captured enemy soldiers. He is offering the cigarette because offering a cigarette is what you do when another human being is in your custody. Because the act of offering a cigarette is the specific and socially embedded gesture whose meaning in American social culture is the acknowledgement of shared humanity across an awkward circumstance, whose performance requires nothing of the person offering it except the cigarette and the willingness to extend the gesture, and whose receipt by the person receiving it communicates in the most immediate possible way that the situation, while not ideal for either party, is manageable, that the prisoner is going to be treated as a person, and that the person offering the cigarette understands, on some level, that neither the corporal's training nor his education has given him the vocabulary to articulate, but that his cultural formation has given him the instinct to act on, that the man who has been shooting at him for the last hour was doing it for approximately the same reasons the corporal was shooting back. It is, in the corporal's cultural formation and in the American soldier's cultural practice, the natural thing to do. The Feldwebel, whose professional training has prepared him for capture in terms of the 3 pieces of information that the German army has told him the enemy is entitled to, name, rank, and serial number, and whose ideological preparation has told him, in the specific and documented way of the German military's 1942 ideological instruction, that the Americans are likely to be hostile and potentially brutal with their prisoners, has not been prepared for this. The cigarette does not fit the training. The cigarette does not fit the ideological preparation. The cigarette fits only the specific and human reality of 2 men in an awkward situation in North Africa in November 1942, one of whom has a cigarette and one of whom wants one. He takes the cigarette. He smokes it in the specific and private way of a man who is processing something that his training has not prepared him for. He will remember it for the rest of his life, remember it as the first piece of evidence that the war's premise, at least on this side of it, was different from the premise he had been fighting under. The cigarette transaction in a prisoner holding area or at the point of capture, the specific and documented practice of American soldiers offering cigarettes to enemy prisoners in circumstances that range from the individual capture in a slit trench to the mass surrender of a surrounded battalion, to the formal prisoner processing operation that the military police runs behind the lines, is one of the behavioral observations that appears most consistently in German professional assessments of American soldiers throughout the entire Second World War. It appears in the records of encounters from North Africa in 1942, through the Italian campaign, through the Normandy fighting, through the Rhineland, and into Germany itself, consistent across theaters and across unit types, and across the rank spectrum from private to colonel. It appears in the foreign military studies interviews that the American Army conducted with German officers after the war, interviews whose systematic collection of German professional observations about American military behavior has been one of the most valuable sources for the subsequent historical study of the war's cultural and psychological dimensions, and whose files on the specific subject of American prisoner treatment return to the cigarette with the consistency of a pattern that no amount of analytical framework building has fully explained to the German professionals who experienced it. It appears in the prisoner interrogation reports, that German intelligence units filed when their own soldiers were returned from American captivity through the administrative channels of the Geneva Convention's prisoner exchange provisions. Reports whose behavioral observation sections note the cigarette with the specific and recurring language of a report category that has been established because the behavior has been reported often enough to warrant the category. It appears in the diary entries and the memoirs of German soldiers who were held in American prisoner of war camps and who described their initial encounter with American military culture, the first hours and the first days of their captivity, in the specific and recurring terms of the cigarette that was offered before the interrogation began and before anything else was established except that the prisoner was in American custody. The observation is consistent across every campaign in which German soldiers have been captured by American forces. The observation is puzzling to the German professional in the specific and documented way that a behavioral pattern puzzles the professional whose analytical framework has not been designed to explain it. Puzzling, not because the behavior is technically incomprehensible, but because the behavior's cultural logic is opaque to the German professional's training. And the observation, in its deepest and most analytically significant dimension, is not about cigarettes. What the cigarette transaction represents, what German officers who observed it in the prisoner holding areas, or who debriefed their own returning soldiers and heard about it from them, are consistently trying to categorize when they note it in their professional assessments and their after-action reports, is the behavioral expression of a fundamental and operationally significant difference between the American soldier's understanding of his relationship to the enemy and the German soldier's understanding of that same relationship. The difference is not a difference in courage or in tactical skill or in the willingness to impose violence on the adversary. The German army has encountered enough of the American army to know that the difference is not there. The difference is in the category to which the enemy is assigned. Whether the enemy is a person who happens to be fighting you, whose having been fighting you is the product of the specific and contingent circumstance of the war, rather than the essential and defining fact about his humanity, or an ideological obstacle whose humanity is conditional on his relationship to the categories that determine human worth, in the German state's 1943 understanding of that question. Categories of race and nationality and political affiliation whose application to the adversary has been producing, since 1939, the conduct of the German military in the occupied territories that the Foreign Military Studies program will eventually be analyzing alongside the cigarette observations. The German military's professional culture has been built, in the Second World War, and in the accelerating ideological incorporation of the Nazi state's premises into the Wehrmacht's institutional culture since the mid-1930s, on the specific and increasingly institutionalized dehumanization of the adversary that the Nazi state's ideology requires, and that the German military's training has increasingly incorporated since 1938, with the specific and cumulative weight of the ideological instruction, the political officer's influence, and the combat experiences whose violence has been justified to the German soldier through the framework that defines the adversary as something other than the German soldier's moral equal. The adversary is not a person, he is the enemy, and the enemy is not a recipient of cigarettes, but an obstacle to be destroyed, or a prisoner to be processed. The American soldier's cultural formation has not been built on this premise. It has been built on the premise, the specific and democratically embedded premise of an egalitarian social culture, that the enemy is a person who happens to be on the other side, and that the other side's being wrong does not make its soldiers less than human, and that the cigarette at the point of capture is the acknowledgement of this premise in its simplest possible form. This is not a policy, it is a culture, and it is the culture that German officers are encountering when they observe the cigarette and recording in their assessments, with the professional puzzlement of men who have been trained to understand combat behavior in terms that the cigarette does not fit. The American military's relationship to cigarettes in the Second World War is a relationship whose scale is, by any measure, extraordinary. The United States produces approximately 630 million cigarettes per day at the peak of the war's production, a production rate that reflects the specific and commercial organization of the American economy's tobacco industry, which has been converted to the full war production priority that the military's assessment of the cigarette's morale function has justified and whose output is being directed to military supply through a distribution system whose efficiency reflects the American military's logistical capability at its characteristic best. A significant proportion of that production is directed to military supply through the K-ration, the C-ration, and the specific and systematic inclusion of cigarettes in the American soldiers' daily supply allocation that the military's understanding of the cigarette's morale function has established since the First World War. Every K-ration, the individual daily ration of the American soldier in combat, whose compact design reflects the logistical constraint of feeding a soldier through the forward supply chain with the minimum of weight and volume, includes a package of 4 cigarettes, whose presence in the ration package has been a design specification since the K-ration's development in 1942, and whose inclusion reflects the American military's assessment of the cigarette as a morale resource of the first order. Every C-ration includes 3 cigarettes. The Army's bulk supply system, operating separately from the ration supply chain, distributes additional cigarettes to unit-level supply points through the quartermaster system at rates that reflect the same assessment, that the cigarette is not a luxury, but a morale necessity, whose consistent availability to the troops is as operationally significant as the consistent availability of ammunition. By 1944, the average American soldier in combat consumes more cigarettes per day than he did as a civilian, because the military supply system has been making cigarettes available at rates and at prices that civilian life did not replicate. The cigarette is the American soldier's primary informal currency in the specific and documented way of a military economy, whose soldiers have established the cigarette as the medium of exchange for the transactions that military life's informal economy produces. The trade for better equipment, the purchase of local goods, the negotiation with the civilian population of the occupied and liberated territory whose relationship with the American soldiers is mediated through the common language of the cigarette offer. The cigarette is his primary social ritual, the shared smoke whose performance marks the transition between the violent engagement and the human reconnection that follows it, whose distribution signals the end of one period and the beginning of another, whose social function in the American soldier's life has been established since his civilian experience and has been intensified by the military experience's specific and repetitive demands. The cigarette is his primary method of marking time in the specific and repetitive way that combats waiting periods, the hours between the operations, the days between the advances, the long afternoons in the static defensive positions, require marking in the specific and sensory way that boredom and anxiety together demand. And the cigarette is his primary medium of social exchange with every person he encounters, Allied soldiers of every nationality, French and Italian and Belgian civilians whose gratitude for liberation expresses itself in the acceptance of the cigarette that the American soldier offers before he has found the French or the Italian to say anything else, and, when the opportunity presents itself, the enemy soldiers who are in his custody. July 11, 1943. Gela, Sicily, on the coastal plain whose flat and open terrain has just seen 60 German tanks advance to within 800 yards of the beach, before naval gunfire from USS Boise and USS Savannah stopped them and began pushing them back. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division's counterattack against the 1st Infantry Division's beachhead has been stopped in the morning hours by the combination of artillery, naval gunfire and Rangers whose defensive action has saved the beachhead by the margin of 800 yards. The prisoners taken from the German armoured columns in the fighting on the Gela Plain are being processed by the division's military police and intelligence teams in the holding area near the beach. Oberleutnant Klaus Brandt, a company officer of the Hermann Göring Division whose tank has been disabled by naval gunfire in the morning's fighting, a composite character drawn from the documented pattern of German prisoner observations from this period, is watching the American soldier who has been assigned to guard his prisoner group as the processing begins. The American soldier is from the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Infantry Regiment, a sergeant whose combat experience extends from the November 1942 North African landings through the Tunisia campaign's conclusion in May 1943, and who has been processing prisoners long enough to have developed the specific and practiced efficiency of a soldier who has done this many times. He is distributing cigarettes from the pack that he has been carrying in the breast pocket of his field jacket since the morning's supply issue, distributing them as casually and as automatically as he distributes them to his own soldiers at the end of an operation, because the distribution of cigarettes to the men around him is the specific and habitual social act of a soldier whose daily life has organized itself around the cigarette's social function, not to the officers only, to everyone. to the enlisted men whose rank the paybook in their breast pocket will establish, and whose names the processing team will record, to the NCOs whose chevrons the sergeant recognizes, and whose professional status the recognition does not change for purposes of the cigarette distribution, to the officers if they want them, and the officers want them, because officers smoke at the same rate as enlisted men, and because the experience of the morning's fighting and the experience of surrender have not reduced the desire for a cigarette. He does not ask who they are, or what unit they are from, or what they know before distributing the cigarettes. He distributes the cigarettes as the first act of the prisoner processing, before the intelligence officers whose job is the "what unit are you from" questioning arrive, before the documentation whose purpose is the name, rank, serial number recording begins, before anything has been established except that these men are prisoners and that prisoners in the custody of the 1st Infantry Division get cigarettes. Brandt watches this with the specific and professional attention of a German officer who is storing the observation for later processing, storing it alongside the other observations he has been making since his capture in the morning's fighting, observations that will eventually be organized into the mental catalogue of American military behavior that returning German prisoners who are debriefed by the German Prisoner of War Administration's Psychological Operations section all provide, each one adding a data point to the pattern whose consistency across theaters and campaigns and unit types is the pattern's most significant characteristic. He takes the cigarette, he smokes it, he does not fully understand it. He will spend the next 2 years thinking about it. The near failure in the German professional's understanding of the cigarette behavior, the moment when the systematic analysis of the pattern comes closest to correctly identifying what the behavior actually represents, rather than what the German analytical framework predicts it should represent, arrives in the autumn of 1943, when the German Prisoner of War Administration's Psychological Operations section, reviewing the after-action reports and the debrief records of German soldiers who have been repatriated from American prisoner of war camps through the prisoner exchange mechanisms and the repatriation of severely wounded prisoners that the Geneva Convention's administrative provisions allow, begins noting the specific and consistent pattern whose consistency is the pattern's most analytically important characteristic. The returning soldiers, debriefed by the Psychological Operations section's interview teams, in the systematic and professional way of an institution that is trying to extract the maximum intelligence value from the experiences of repatriated prisoners, describe the cigarette at the point of capture as the first and, in many ways, the most disorienting element of their experience as American prisoners. Not the camps, whose physical conditions the returning soldiers describe in the specific and comparative terms of men who have been in the German Army's Eastern Front billets and who find the American prisoner of war camps, whatever their limitations, substantially superior to the conditions those billets have accustomed them to. Not the food, which is similarly better than the returning soldiers expected and which the specific and documented administration of the American prisoner of war system has been providing at the rates and the qualities that the convention requires. The cigarette at the point of capture, the moment when a man who has been trying to kill the person in front of him for the last several hours or the last several days or the last several minutes, and who has been prepared by his training and his ideological formation to expect a reciprocal hostility from the person who has just taken his weapon and whose side is winning, is instead offered a cigarette by a 21-year-old from Ohio whose manner in making the offer does not suggest that the offer is calculated or strategic or anything other than what it appears to be, the natural extension of a social ritual toward a man who has just become his prisoner and who might want a cigarette. The German Psychological Operations section's analysis of this pattern attempts to categorize the behavior as a calculated intelligence technique, a method of softening the prisoner's resistance to interrogation by establishing a false rapport whose warmth the prisoner will mistake for genuine human connection. The analysis is professionally competent. It is also wrong. The cigarette is not a technique, it is a habit. The habit is the expression in behavior of the specific and embedded social norms of the American society that produced the soldier who is performing it. The norms of a democratic and commercially embedded culture in which the cigarette is the primary social lubricant of male interaction across class and regional lines, in which offering a cigarette to a man in an awkward situation is the universal first move of human connection, and in which the connection has priority over the category, because the category, enemy, prisoner, German, is a temporary designation imposed by the specific and temporary circumstances of the war, while the connection, human being dealing with human being in a difficult moment, is the permanent and prior fact. The German Psychological Operations section's analytical framework has not been designed to accommodate this premise. September 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. In the first week of the American Army's assault against the Siegfried Line's defended positions in the dense forest terrain east of Aachen, where the American advance into Germany has reached its first major natural and constructed obstacle. The 4th Infantry Division, under General Raymond Barton, is fighting through the Hürtgen's defended positions in fighting that is some of the most brutal of the entire European campaign. Close infantry combat in the dense fir forest, whose terrain eliminates the American Army's tactical advantages of armor and air support and reduces the fighting to the primitive and personal exchange of men killing each other in a space of a few hundred yards at a time. In the conditions of the Hürtgen's mud and rain, and the German defensive positions whose preparation in the forest's broken terrain has been converting every clearing and every firebreak into a killing ground. Major Otto Schreiber, a composite character drawn from the pattern of German after-action assessments of this period, is the commanding officer of a German infantry company that has been fighting the 4th Division's 12th Infantry Regiment for 3 days in the fighting around the Hürtgen village of Görmete. His company is surrounded on September 20th in the fighting around Görmete when the 12th Infantry Regiment's flanking movement closes the last open route from the German defensive position that Schreiber's company has been holding for 3 days. His company surrenders in the specific and organized way of professional soldiers who have recognized the military situation's conclusion and who are performing the surrender with the military bearing that the German Army's training establishes as the appropriate conduct, even in capitulation. His company is processed by the 12th Infantry's military police and intelligence teams in the holding area that the regiment has established in the forest clearing 400 meters behind the front line. And the first thing that happens after the surrender is formally accepted, and after the weapons have been stacked, and after the prisoners have been organized into the formation that the processing requires. Is that the American soldier who accepted the surrender, a first lieutenant from the 12th Infantry's B Company, whose name is not preserved in the records of this specific encounter, distributes cigarettes, one to each man in the organized formation of German prisoners who have just surrendered their weapons and their position in the Hürtgen forest, and who are standing in the cold September rain of the forest clearing, waiting for the processing that will move them from the tactical holding area to the regimental prisoner collection point, to the divisional cage, to the army-level prisoner of war camp, whose existence they know about in the abstract, and whose specific character they do not yet know. 1 cigarette each, including Schreiber, whose rank the lieutenant has identified from the shoulder boards, and who receives the cigarette from the lieutenant's own hand, rather than from the cigarette distribution that the lieutenant is directing his soldiers to perform for the enlisted prisoners, including the soldiers who have been fighting this lieutenant's platoon for 3 days in the Hürtgen's mud, and whose faces the lieutenant has not seen before this morning. Schreiber takes the cigarette with the specific and visible surprise of a man who has been prepared for a different experience, and who is revising his preparation in real time as the cigarette arrives. He smokes it, in the cold September rain of the Hürtgen forest's clearing, in the specific and immediate physical comfort of the inhaled smoke, whose warmth is the first warmth he has experienced since the dawn when the surrounding of his position began. He files the observation in the mental catalogue of American behavior that he will later, in the Foreign Military Studies interview, that the American Army's historical program will conduct after the war, in the systematic and professional setting of the American historian's debrief of the German officer, whose operational experiences the program is documenting, describe as the single most consistent and most professionally inexplicable characteristic of the American soldiers' treatment of German prisoners, the cigarette offered at the point of capture, before anything else, before the questioning begins, before the formal processing establishes the prisoner's status. Every time, from Oran in November 1942 to the Tunisia campaign's conclusion in May 1943, to the Sicily campaign and the Gela Beach, to the Italian campaign's grinding progress up the peninsula, to the Normandy landing and the Hürtgen forest in September 1944, to the Ardennes in December 1944, to the Siegfried Line and the Rhine crossings and the advance into the German heartland in March and April 1945, every campaign, every theater where American soldiers have been taking German prisoners. Every time. The legacy of why German officers said American soldiers traded cigarettes with enemy prisoners mid-battle is a legacy that runs through the entire history of the American military's conduct in the Second World War. Through the prisoner handling in North Africa and Sicily, and Italy, and France and Germany. Through the formal prisoner of war camps whose conditions the International Red Cross monitored and found consistent with the Geneva Convention's requirements. Through the specific and documented instances of American soldiers treating captured German soldiers with a correctness and sometimes with a generosity that the German military's professional culture had not predicted, and that the German professionals' analytical framework had difficulty categorizing. It runs through the entire history, and it connects, at its deepest level, to the question of what the American soldier understood himself to be fighting for. The cigarette is not the story. The cigarette is the evidence. What the cigarette evidences, what the German officers who observed it and recorded it in their professional assessments were actually observing, is the specific and operational expression of the American soldier's relationship to the idea of the enemy as a person. The German military's ideological training has been building, since 1935, and accelerating since 1939, the systematic dehumanization of the adversary that the Nazi state's conduct of the war requires, and that the German soldiers' performance of the war's atrocities has been enabled by. The American soldier's cultural formation has not been building this. The American soldier's cultural formation has been building the opposite, the specific and democratic proposition that human beings are human beings regardless of their relationship to the state's current political project, that the man in the uniform of the enemy is a man first and an enemy second, and that the war's ending, even in the small and individual sense of this particular soldier's capture, does not require the additional violence of treating the prisoner as something less than what his humanity makes him. The American soldier has been fighting a war whose articulated purpose, the defeat of fascism and its specific denial of human dignity as the operative principle of political organization, the liberation of the occupied countries, whose populations the occupation has been treating as categories rather than as people, the restoration of the democratic order whose destruction the Axis has been pursuing with the specific and systematic application of state power since the early 1930s, is built on the affirmation of the human dignity that the enemy has been denying. The cigarette at the point of capture is the operational expression of this affirmation in its most immediate and most personal form. The acknowledgement that the man who has been trying to kill you was doing it as a soldier, following orders in a war that his government started, and that the war's ending, even in the small and individual sense of this particular prisoner's capture, is the restoration of the human relationship that the war has been interrupting. The cigarette is the restoration in its simplest form, the smallest possible act of human recognition in the specific and human moment of capture, whose performance costs the giver nothing except the cigarette, and whose receipt by the prisoner costs the prisoner nothing except the acknowledgement that the gesture is what it appears to be, human. The German officer who received it, and who recorded his puzzlement in the professional assessment that the Foreign Military Studies program eventually preserved, could not fully explain why the American soldier did it. The puzzlement is genuine. The German professional has been trained in a culture that has been building, since 1935, the systematic framework for understanding the adversary as a category, rather than as a person, and the cigarette does not fit the category framework. The cigarette requires a different framework, the framework of the person rather than the category, and the German officer's training has not built that framework in him. He could tell the interviewer what happened. The American soldier offered him a cigarette. The offer was not preceded by a demand for information. It was not conditioned on compliance. It was not withheld based on rank or based on the prisoner's behavior before capture, or based on anything except the American soldier's possession of a cigarette and his judgment that the prisoner probably wanted one. He could not tell the interviewer what it meant, because explaining what it meant requires explaining the culture that produced it, the culture of American democratic egalitarianism, the culture of the commercial and social ubiquity of the cigarette in 1940s American life, the culture of a military organization that understood its soldiers as citizens, temporarily in uniform rather, than as instruments of the state, and the culture that produced it was so different from the culture the German officer had been trained in, that the cigarette remained, in his professional assessment, the unexplained fact of a behavior whose human logic was visible to everyone who encountered it, and whose cultural logic the German professional framework was not equipped to supply. The American soldier offered his prisoner a cigarette because he had one, and the prisoner probably needed it, and because in the American soldier's cultural formation, the need of the man in front of you for the thing you have is a sufficient reason to provide it, regardless of the category the man occupies in the formal organizational chart of the current conflict. That was the whole of it. The transaction required no strategic calculation and no intelligence objective and no policy directive from a higher headquarters whose understanding of the prisoner relationship would tell the soldier what to do. It required only the cigarette and the recognition that the man in front of him was a man. In 1945, when the war ends and the full record of what has been done in the name of the ideology that denied that recognition is visible to everyone who wants to see it, the cigarette's cultural logic, the premise that the man in front of you is a man, regardless of his relationship to the current political project, turns out to be the premise that was correct. That turned out to be enough